There's a very specific kind of fear that most people never have to confront. It's not the fear of something lurking in the dark outside your window or the fear of what might be hiding under your bed. It's something quieter than that. Something that gets into your skin and stays there long after the lights come back on. It's the fear of realizing, slowly, horribly, that the place you call home was never entirely yours. And these are 10 real accounts from people across the country who discovered, in the most unsettling ways possible, that someone else had been sharing their space, eating their food, sleeping while they slept, watching while they went about their lives, completely unaware. If you're alone right now, you may want to reconsider listening to this. The cereal box. Marcus moved into his new apartment in October. It was a ground floor unit, cheap rent, older building, thick walls. But he worked nights at a distribution warehouse, which meant he slept during the day and had the building almost entirely to himself in the evenings. For the first few weeks, everything was fine. Then the small things started. It began with a box of cereal. Marcus was meticulous about his groceries. Not obsessively so, just the natural rhythm of a man living alone who knew exactly how much food he had at any given time. He'd bought a box of cornflakes on a Wednesday. By Friday morning, when he came home from his shift and poured himself a bowl before bed, the box was noticeably lighter than he remembered. He told himself he'd eaten more than he thought. Then his shampoo started running out faster than usual. Then one afternoon, he woke up to the faint, almost imperceptible, smell of cigarette smoke drifting from somewhere inside the apartment. Marcus didn't smoke. He'd never smoked. He walked every room, sniffing at vents, checking windows. Nothing. But the smell was there. He mentioned it to his building manager, who shrugged and blamed old ductwork. It was only when Marcus decided to do a deep clean of his apartment, moving furniture, pulling out the refrigerator, that he found it. Behind the refrigerator, flush against the back wall, was a small door, no more than 3 feet high. He'd never noticed it before. The previous tenant had apparently pushed the refrigerator in front of it, and the building manager claimed to have no record of it on the floor plan. Marcus called a friend. Together, they opened it. Behind the door was a crawl space, roughly the size of a large walk-in closet. Inside, a sleeping bag, a small battery-powered lantern, an ashtray with old cigarette butts, a stack of paperback novels, and a box, nearly empty, of cornflakes. Whoever it was, they were gone by then. But the question that Marcus says still keeps him awake isn't who it was, or even how they got in. It's how many times they must have come out while he was sleeping. When Dana moved into her childhood home after her mother passed, she assumed the hardest part would be the grief. Sorting through decades of accumulated life, the silence where her mother's voice used to be. She didn't expect anything else to be wrong with the house. It was a large farmhouse-style property on the edge of a rural town in central Ohio. 2 stories, a full basement, a detached garage. Dana had grown up there, so knew every creak in the floor, every draft from every window. She thought she knew the house completely. On her 3rd week back, she found a key on the kitchen counter that she didn't recognize. Old, brass, slightly worn. She assumed it had been her mother's, for a lockbox maybe, or a filing cabinet, and set it aside. But something about it nagged at her. She mentioned it to her mother's neighbor, an older woman named Ruth, who had been close with the family for 30 years. Ruth went pale. But she told Dana that about 8 months before her mother passed, during a period when her mother had been in and out of the hospital, there had been a man, someone who had been seen around the property a few times. Ruth had assumed he was a handyman or a distant relative. She'd never asked. Dana checked every lock in the house with that key. None of them matched. Then she went to the basement. In the far corner, behind a shelving unit she'd never had reason to move, was a door she'd somehow never noticed as a child, or perhaps had simply forgotten. It led to a small utility room that connected to a storm cellar exit on the far side of the house. The utility room wasn't empty. There was evidence of recent habitation, not old, dusty remnants, recent. Canned food with current expiration dates, a folding chair, a small space heater still faintly warm to the touch when Dana pressed her hand near it. And on the wall, written in pencil, in were 3 lines Dana still refuses to repeat in full. She'll only say that they made clear the person had been watching the house, watching her, and had known she would be moving in long before she had. She sold the property within the month. She says she still sometimes wakes up in the night and lies completely still in the dark of her new apartment, listening for breathing that isn't hers. Joel and Priya set up a nanny cam in their living room after their babysitter mentioned she'd heard noises coming from the attic 2 nights in a row while watching their daughter. They assumed it was squirrels. The cam was more for reassurance than anything else. They didn't think to check the footage for over a week. When Priya finally sat down with a cup of coffee and pulled up the recordings, she started from the most recent and worked backward, a fast-forwarding through hours of empty living room, their daughter playing with toys, the babysitter watching TV. She almost missed it. On a Tuesday night at 2:17 a.m., visible in the upper left corner of the frame near the hallway entrance, something moved. She rewound it, watched it again, and again. A figure, a person, clearly an adult, stepping silently from the direction of the hallway, crossing a few feet of visible floor and disappearing toward the kitchen. And they were dressed in dark clothing. They moved with an unsettling deliberateness, like someone who was very familiar with the layout of a space in the dark. They were in the kitchen for 11 minutes, according to the timestamp. Then they came back through the frame, heading toward the hallway again, and were gone. It had happened on a night when Joel and Priya were both upstairs asleep. Their daughter was in her room down the hall. Joel called the police. An officer came to inspect the attic. At the far end of the attic, tucked behind the insulation, he found a section of plywood that had been laid down as flooring, a sleeping bag, an old camping backpack, and a small collection of food wrappers, some dating back, based on expiration dates, nearly 5 months. There was one more thing, a piece of paper with handwriting on it. The officer wouldn't tell them what it said and was vague about whether it was relevant to the investigation. Miss Priya says that the officer's expression when he read it was the thing that scared her most. Not what was found, but the way the man's face changed when he looked at that paper. They moved out that weekend. They have never gone back. The building had 12 units. Apartment 4B, according to the landlord, had been vacant for over a year. Corinne lived in 4A. She was a light sleeper and worked from home. And she'd been complaining to the landlord for weeks about noises coming through her shared wall with 4B soft thuds. The occasional sound of water running. Footsteps. The landlord kept telling her it was the pipes. Corinne was not a woman easily dismissed. She started keeping a log. Date, time, description of sound, duration. She slid the log under the landlord's door. He stopped returning her calls, so Corinne took matters into her own hands. She befriended the building's maintenance man, and a soft-spoken man named Gerald who'd worked the building for 19 years. She showed him her log. Gerald got very quiet. He told her that there had been a tenant in 4B, a man in his 40s who'd lived there for 11 years. When the lease ended, the landlord had declined to renew it. The man had refused to leave, and the eviction had been a long, complicated legal process. Gerald had assumed the man was gone. He and Corinne went to the landlord together. And the landlord reluctantly agreed to inspect the unit. When they opened the door to 4B, which the landlord had claimed was empty and rekeyed, they found it occupied. Not just with a sleeping bag and supplies, but fully occupied. Furniture, a television, food in the refrigerator, a calendar on the wall with dates circled and notes written in a small, neat hand. The man had never left. He'd been living in the unit, entirely rent-free and seemingly unbothered for over 13 months. And according to Gerald, he'd even repainted the living room. He was charged with trespassing. The landlord was separately investigated for his role in the matter. How he had failed to discover this during routine inspections remains officially unexplained. Corinne moved out 2 weeks later. She says not because of the man in 4B, but because of something Gerald told her quietly on her way out, that her log of sounds had started 8 weeks into her tenancy. That the earliest sound she had documented was not, as she'd assumed, from 4B. It was from directly above her unit, from the 5th floor. The building only had 4. Theo bought his house at auction. It was a foreclosure, a 2-bedroom craftsman bungalow in a quiet neighborhood, priced well under market because of some structural work it needed. Theo was handy. He wasn't afraid of a project. He spent his first month gutting the bathroom and stripping wallpaper from the 2nd bedroom. It was during the wallpaper removal that he found the photographs. They were tucked between the drywall and an old layer of plaster in a recessed area behind where a radiator had once been. A small bundle wrapped in a plastic bag to protect them from moisture. Maybe 30 photographs. Theo assumed they were old. Something left behind by a previous owner years ago, sentimental items misplaced during a renovation. But when he looked closer, he realized some of them were recent. By within the last few years, at least based on the quality and format of the prints, and many of them were photographs of the outside of the house. Not the house as it once was. The house as it currently was, showing the front porch with the same broken step Theo had been meaning to fix, the same overgrown rose bush along the fence, the same slightly crooked mailbox. There were also photographs of the street, the neighbors' cars, the nearest bus stop, and in several of them, captured from an angle that could only have come from inside the house, from an upstairs window, photographs of the backyard. Theo brought in a contractor friend to help him understand the layout of the walls he was renovating. They discovered that a section of the 2nd bedroom's closet extended further back than it should have, based on the exterior measurements of the house. There was a false back wall in the closet that had been framed in at some point after the original construction. And they removed it. The space behind it was empty, but it was clear it had not always been so. There was a small, round indentation in the floor from something that had rested there for a long time, roughly the diameter and depth of a stool leg, and at a height of about 5.5 feet, on the wall that faced the window, there was a small, carefully made hole. Looking through it, you had a perfect, unobstructed view of the bed. For 6 months, and Nina thought the woman in the unit above hers was just a very quiet neighbor. Nina lived on the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian. The 3rd floor had been a single unit for many years, but had recently been subdivided into 2 smaller apartments. As far as Nina knew, one of those units was occupied by a graduate student named Lena, whom she'd met briefly in the hallway once. The other, she'd been told, was vacant. But sometimes she heard someone up there. Soft footsteps, and the occasional faint sound of running water late at night. She didn't think much of it. It was an old building, and she assumed it was Lena. Everything changed when Lena knocked on Nina's door one evening holding a casserole dish. She wanted to thank Nina for leaving meals outside her door during exam season, she said. It had been so thoughtful, the soups and the pasta and the little notes. Nina had not left any meals. She had not left any notes. And they stood in the doorway staring at each other for a moment. Then Lena mentioned that she'd been meaning to ask about the woman she sometimes saw on the staircase between their floors. An older woman, quiet, who always smiled when they passed each other and occasionally asked about Nina by name. Nina had no idea who she was describing. Together, they contacted the building manager and requested an inspection of the vacant unit on the 3rd floor. The building manager insisted the unit was empty and unoccupied. It was not. A woman in her late 60s had been living there for approximately 4 months. She had found the unit unsecured during a building repair and had simply moved in. She was not threatening. She was not volatile. She was, by every observable measure, a quiet and considerate tenant who had, at some point, learned Nina's name and schedule well enough to know when she wasn't home. And the meal she had been leaving for Lena had been cooked on a hot plate she'd purchased from a thrift store. She was gently removed from the building and connected with social services. Nina says she holds no ill will toward the woman, but she can't entirely explain why, every time she opens her front door now, she checks the staircase first. Andrew and his wife Sarah use their guest room maybe 5 or 6 times a year. Family visits, out-of-town friends passing through. But the rest of the time it sat closed, clean, made up, untouched. Which is why it took them so long to notice. It started with Sarah remarking that the pillow on the left side of the guest bed looked flattened, like someone had slept on it. They figured they'd just forgotten to fluff it after the last guest. Then Andrew noticed the window latch was undone, even though he was certain he locked all the windows at the start of every fall. And then Sarah found a coffee mug in the guest room. Not one of their mugs, a plain white mug, the kind from a diner or an office break room. It had been rinsed, but there was a faint ring at the bottom. They called it a mystery. They laughed about it mostly. The explanation came from their neighbor across the street, who came to them one afternoon looking awkward and hesitant. He had seen someone entering their house while they were both at work, multiple times, through the side window, which, it turned out, had been quietly and carefully unlatched from the outside, a task that was surprisingly easy given the age of the window frame. The person, their neighbor described, moved like someone who had done it many times before. They always left before Andrew and Sarah came home. They reviewed their Ring camera footage going back 90 days, 12 separate visits, each between 2 and 4 hours long. The person always used the same window, always left no obvious trace, almost no trace, because when Andrew looked closely at the guest room, really looked the way you look at something you've been taking for granted, he found the one thing they'd missed. On the inside of the closet door, at exactly eye height, someone had scratched 4 small horizontal lines and 1 diagonal one, like a count being kept in a prison cell. They had no way of knowing what was being counted. That ambiguity, Andrew says, is the part that never fully leaves him. The college dormitory had been built in 1961 and had not been significantly renovated since the early 1990s. This meant, among other things, that its infrastructure was a labyrinth of old utility tunnels, steam pipes, electrical conduits, maintenance corridors, running beneath and between the buildings like a forgotten circulatory system. Most students didn't know about them. Campus facilities staff did. And as it turned out, so did at least one other person. Hadley was a junior who lived in a single room at the end of the hall on the 3rd floor. She started noticing things going missing. Small things at first, things you could easily explain away. A phone charger, a granola bar from her desk, a hoodie she could have sworn she'd left on her chair. Then she noticed her laptop had been moved. Not taken, moved. Shifted a few inches from where she'd left it, the screen angled differently. As she was certain enough about it that she mentioned it to her RA, who filed a report but couldn't do much without evidence. Hadley bought a small motion-activated camera, the kind usually used for wildlife monitoring, and aimed it at her desk. The footage showed her room from 4 a.m. to 4:43 a.m. on a Wednesday night, empty. And then it showed a section of the baseboard near the far wall shifting inward. And then it showed a person stepping out of the wall. The facilities director, and when brought in to explain, could barely believe what he was looking at. The baseboard had, at some point in the distant past, concealed a small maintenance access panel for the heating system. It connected to the utility tunnel network. Someone had been using it as a private entrance for at least, based on their best estimates of the evidence found in the adjacent tunnel, several months. The access panel was sealed the next day. And campus security found a small cache of items in the tunnel section that ran beneath Hadley's floor. Several books with her name written inside, her missing charger, and a journal. The journal was not hers. What was written in it was never officially disclosed, and Hadley says the detective who interviewed her about it asked her very specific, very careful questions that told her almost as much as any answer could have. She transferred schools the following semester. Now, Walter was 71 years old, recently widowed, and living alone in the house he had shared with his wife for 43 years. His children worried about him, called often, visited when they could. He was, by his own description, a man who had always valued his routines, his morning coffee, his evening news, his Wednesday calls to his daughter in Portland. He began to feel, sometime in the autumn after his wife passed, that the house was not quite right. Not haunted. Walter was not a superstitious man. Just off. Like a room where someone has moved the furniture a half-inch while you were away. His coffee, he thought, was lasting less long than it should. He mentioned it to his daughter, who told him gently that grief had a way of making people distracted and forgetful. Then one morning, Walter came downstairs to find a chair in the kitchen had been moved from one side of the table to the other. He had not moved it. He lived alone, and he mentioned it again. This time his son drove out to visit. His son found the chair. He also noticed, walking the property, that a latch on the back door of the attached garage was damaged in a way that would have made it trivially easy to open from outside. He also noticed in the garage that a section of shelving he remembered being stacked against the wall had been moved, and that behind it was a door to a small storage room he'd never known was there. Inside, a cot, blankets, a battery lantern, food, neatly organized, and a coffee tin, the same brand Walter bought, about a third full. The local police identified the individual relatively quickly. A man in his 50s who had been living transient for some time, who had discovered the garage access and the storage room and had been quietly supplementing his own supplies from Walter's kitchen for months. What he would tell investigators later was that he had become fond of the old man, and he had made a point never to disturb him or frighten him. He said this with what appeared to be genuine sincerity. Walter, when told this, sat quietly for a long time. Then he said, "He sat in my wife's chair. He sold the house in the spring. The last story doesn't have a tidy resolution. I want to warn you about that up front." Jess had been hearing something in her walls for weeks. Not the usual sounds of an old house. She knew those rhythms. I had cataloged them over 4 years of living there. This was different, intermittent, faintly rhythmic, like breath. She called a pest control company. They found no evidence of animals. She called a plumber. He found nothing in the